Right, it is 2 o'clock. Welcome to the Democratic Service meeting, and I'll go on to the agenda. First of all, any apologies?
Yes, Chair, we've had apologies from County Councillor Francis Taylor and Giles Howard.
Right. Declarations of interest, as and when? Right. Number 3 is the public open forum. As there's no public, Councillor Easton would like to speak. Are you all happy with that? Right.
Thank you, Chair. This is a matter I'd like Democratic Services community to be aware of. It's the position of Chair of SACRI, to which I'm a member, and I think there should be a little bit of history as to why we failed to really institute a chair until the last moment of last term. The meeting of the SACRI held on June the 9th, 2017 failed to gain the support for the election of a nominated member of SACRI to become chair of the committee, which has been the practice since I've been a member of SACRI without any dissent. Although the minutes of the meeting do not fully reflect the context of the dissent shown on that date. As a consequence, the decision was deferred until advice was sought by the SACRI advisor, who was engaged by EAS, from the Monitor Officer and Democratic Services. The advice received was that each constituent group, that is the teachers, the religious group members and Monmouthshire County Council members, would each have a nomination to the position of chair. That decision was in line with written advice within the Education Act 1988, where it requires that each LEA must constitute a SACRI. And either the council appoints a chair from council or allows SACRI to nominate and appoint its own chair from its members, which has been the case for the last 9 years since I've been there. So having been a member of SACRI for 9 years, where the collective members elected the chair from the floor, I asked members of Democratic Services to committee to discuss the appointment of chair in the future and some advice, and to support the advice, possibly support the advice given by the Monitor Officer on the basis of the Religious Education and Collective Worship Act 1993, Circular 1094. I've felt quite disappointed having sat through 3 meetings of SACRI last year, where I don't believe that the chair who was nominated gained the respect from the floor. I don't think I should say more about it now, but I just like some thoughts of Democratic Services on the way the chair is elected. And the 3 options are: the council decides itself, or the members from their own ranks decide themselves. And on the basis of that, the Monitor Officer gave a view that each group should have a vote, and that the chair would be nominated or voted in from there. So I say I was disappointed at the way SACRI operated last year, on the basis that I felt the chair didn't have the support of the committee.
Yes, Judah.
I'd like to support Councillor Eason. I sat on the old Gwent SACRI many years ago. I've now sat on Monmouthshire SACRI, and by the nature of my job, I've been involved with RE and RS for sort of 40 years, 20 years teaching, and then 20 years with WJC, the exam board. I've been in every SACRI in Wales. The whole sort of ethos and atmosphere of that committee has changed, and much of that is the fact that some of the elected members don't seem prepared to follow the procedure of a committee. That is, that everything goes through the chair. And in the October meeting, I was not present, unfortunately, but there was great unhappiness from a number of people from the faith community and from the teachers, and in fact some of the teachers have written to this authority. They've yet to gain a response, which I feel quite disappointed by, and I really feel unhappy with the current situation, and I think it's incumbent upon the authority to respond when they have complaints. You know, we are supposedly living in a democratic society, and when people who are part of a committee send a letter of complaint, unfortunately, then I feel we should respond. And if you look at the blurb that's at the front of our papers today, it's about dealing in an open and fair way, and that everybody should have their say. Unfortunately, I feel now that is not the case in SACRI. It is a statutorily organised committee. It is an obligation of the authority, but it's an obligation of the authority as well to see that that committee operates within the rules of MCC. Personally, I feel extremely unhappy. I've never come across this sort of situation in 40 years of my experience.
Joe?
I sat on the SACRA committee as a faith representative for 7 years prior to becoming elected. I am now one of the elected members who sit on SACRA. And SACRA has always in the past been an incredible forum for democracy in this county. It's been one of the most engaged, outward-looking committees that, frankly, I've ever encountered in regards to my work with here at Monmouthshire. It engages with teachers, it engages with a huge variety of faith representatives who live within our community, and everybody in the SACRA in the past was given equal weight and their voices were equally heard. It was a very functional committee. It actually arranged activities in schools, and it really engaged with our electorate. It actually was a very functional working committee. And I'm afraid to say I do have to agree with what Tudor and Tony have stated. Since this year has come along, there has been a real change, and it has been a change for the worse. I now feel like it is an argumentative committee as opposed to a productive committee. I've had representations from the teachers and the other faith communities come to me because they now know that I now sit on the other side, and both of those groups are deeply unhappy with the way the committee has changed. Deeply, deeply unhappy, to the extent that many of them are talking about withdrawing from the SACRA. And the committee is that bad, and it really does need to be changed. So I really do call on the authority to look into this properly and to actually address the concerns, because what was a great way of our working is now really kind of not working out properly at all.
Thank you. Matt, can you add to that? Or give us some guidance, please.
Yeah, thanks very much for the comments. Unfortunately, Kelly isn't with us today. She was hoping to be here, and she probably would have been able to add a lot more detail to what I'm about to say to this. But obviously it's quite concerning to hear some of the comments that have been raised about the meeting, and they're coming up from a number of members of the committee and have to be taken seriously. Kelly, as some of you will be aware, has attended a number of the meetings and has been observing the meetings, and has been tasked, I think, with making a number of sort of recommendations and looking at the operation of the committee. I'm not in a position yet to sort of report back on any of those details, but rest assured that what's been raised has been heard and is being considered as part of a sort of look at the committee. So what I would say in response to what I've heard today, and no doubt further detail that sits behind some of those comments that have been surfaced, I'll have a chat to Kelly and we'll come back and give you an update at the next possible opportunity.
Councillor Easton, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, just a brief comment. I felt quite disturbed at several of the meetings. I can be very careful how I phrase my words because I don't want to be caused to be inflammatory. But I felt that the disrespect to the chair could be seen to be discriminatory to other religions. It could be seen... No, I can't go down that particular route. I do feel rather concerned that there seemed to be a level of discrimination that there seemed to me to be from some members, I say members, the committee, not just county council members, that the representation of Christian faiths was not there. There should be more Christian faiths as opposed to Sikh faith, Muslim faith, or things like that. And that left a fairly nasty taste in my mouth. I'm not agnostic. I'm not a regular churchgoer, but I do believe that any members would have the right to address and follow their own religion without discrimination, which I did find quite strong in a couple of those meetings where, yes, it was felt that there weren't enough Christians running the committee, or that's my words. I think I've rephrased that wrongly. Not enough Christians on the committee to represent the Christian faiths. I felt that quite disturbing, especially you've got all sorts of faiths there, as Joe says, Buddhist faith, Sikh faith, Muslims, Catholics. There is even an addition to the committee the last 12 months of a humanist, not faith, but a humanist don't have any faith. So my disappointment is that all in all, it wasn't just the points that you may have picked up through comments from our members, but there was an underlying concern with me that SACRE was being undermined. The teachers particularly are professional. They've plied their trade for many years in the schools across Monmouthshire. In fact, one of them is the head of RE at Monmouth School. Another teacher was head of school, I think, in Monmouth somewhere. So I felt disturbed that there was this underlying trend that the general Christian faith was being unrepresented within that particular committee, and the numbers didn't add up. I think that's the best way I can phrase it without getting too inflammatory.
Just to reinforce really that the code of conduct's pretty clear. All members have had training on it. In there it says you must carry out your duties and responsibilities with due regard to the principle that it should be equality of opportunity for all people, regardless of race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, age or religion. B, show respect and consideration for others. C, not use bullying behaviour or harass any other person. Members have all received code of conduct training. I'm not sure really it sits with us as a committee to necessarily take this forward, but if what you're insinuating is a breach of the code of conduct, then it would be for Rob as the the monitoring officer, and for the standards committee to possibly consider.
Do you want to come back in, Councillor Easton?
Yes, just to that particular aspect, I have spoken to Robert Tranter as monitoring officer. I felt there was a possible breach of the code of conduct by a or some members. I sought advice from Robert Tranter, and on the basis of me approaching Robert Tranter, I said, should I take this to the Ombudsman? On the basis of meeting with Robert Tranter, he took on board my concerns and said that no, I didn't need to go to take it any further, although I could still, should I so wish. But at the moment, as far as I'm concerned, I've left it with Robert Tranter, who has noted what I've said.
Perhaps then, Chair, it might be worth you writing to Robert Tranter just to see if there's any update that we can bring back at the next meeting on his thoughts.
Yeah. I'm happy to do that. Sorry, Tudor.
Can I add to that? I want an assurance, sitting on this Democratic Services Committee, that there will be a response to letters sent by 2 teachers. To date, they've been sitting there for some months. They state clearly the fact that they felt that some members of the committee did not accept the, as it were, discipline of the chair, and that the meeting, because of that, people were constantly talking and exchanging notes, etc. But I want an assurance that teachers will gain a response. If somebody has a complaint, then surely that should gain a response, and to leave it in the air. I say, I look at our values, supposedly, openness, fairness, flexibility, teamwork. People in that committee now, I think, might well decide that they will not want to attend, and that meeting should be constituted on a tripartite arrangement. It should be the local authority, the faith groups, and teachers. And if people were giving up their time, they're not paid to be there, particularly the faith community, but teachers are giving up their time to be there. They are not going there to be hectored by some members of that committee. They will walk away. And the 1988 Education Reform Act states clearly that, yes, the teaching should be in the main from a Christian point of view. We are a Christian or a post-Christian society, but with due recognition of the other world faiths, which we've had up until now. I feel unless some robust action is taken by this authority, then that will not be the case, and it will be to the detriment of the education of children in Monmouthshire as an authority, and I think it will affect our reputation in terms of how we operate.
Can I ask you, you said they wrote into made a complaint to the authority. Who in the authority did they make a complaint?
the first letter was to Monmouthshire County Council.
Nobody's name.
Not on the first letter. That came from the religious education consultant. The second one was via her, and the third one was via her. So none of them were primarily to any officer of the council.
Thank you, Chair. I've come to this meeting as an observer, but I think I may be able to add something to the discussion that is ensuing now. I have been made aware of a certain amount of disquiet within the SACRE group as to the way in which some of the meetings have been conducted. I've had discussions on a number of occasions with Kelly Byrne, the Deputy Chief Executive of this authority. It's unfortunate that she's not here today, but I think she will be coming back. She could come back to this committee with a report before she leaves this authority, because I think there will be certain changes in the way in which the group is managed and spread that way.
Thank you, Paul. Matt, do you want to come back in?
No, I think that sounds that's absolutely right. I would, as you'd expect, agree with what the cabinet member says. And just to add, in terms of the individuals who've written in, although we don't have the names here, I'll have a chat to Kelly. We'll ensure that those are picked up, and as long as we can identify the correspondence, then I'll ensure that a response does go back to the individuals that have written, because it isn't acceptable if someone writes to us as an organisation and doesn't receive an acknowledgement or a response of any sort. So I will look into that and ensure a response goes back. So if I can pick up with you, Councillor Easton, just to get copies of the correspondence as well, and we'll follow up on that.
Do you want to come back in, Tony? You've had an assurance that I will write a letter, an assurance from Matt that the 2 people or 3 people that wrote in with complaining will get a reply. So are you happy with that, Councillor Easton?
I ask if is the committee happy with that?
Councillor Dovey, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think this sounds that will have nothing to do with the committee. This does sound to be a fairly fundamental issue within this committee, if you like. And we're bearing in mind that Kelly is going to move on ere long, and there might be a little gap between somebody else taking over and getting their feet under the desk, if you like. This does seem to have some urgency, so perhaps would it be worthwhile considering, if we do get a planned way ahead with this, that it could be done before Kelly leaves, and perhaps we could have an emergency committee meeting to make sure that it doesn't somehow drift into the long grass, and we have a planned way ahead with it.
Yes, I'll speak to Kelly when she returns, and I'll arrange that we do a special meeting. I am aware that there is members who want to fetch up certain items. Councillor Woodhouse.
Thank you, Chair. The subject is the General Data Protection Regulation, the new act that's coming in on the 25th of May. We as councillors have had training on that as in our role as a councillor. I'm just thinking I've had lots of inquiries about this from voluntary organisations. Now, I know we have to register as councillors and voluntary organisations have to comply. There seems to be, I'm just looking for some way we can help voluntary organisations with regard to finding out the information they need. There is an awful lot on the Information Commissioner's website, but it's not easy to sift down to what a small group might need. And I'm concerned that there are voluntary organisations who are panicking, quite frankly, about this. Is there some way we, as councillors, could be trained to help these organisations, or could there be a way that we could perhaps point them in the right direction for training from Gavo, for example? I understand Gavo are going to be holding training sessions. The 25th of May is coming closer, ever nearer, and I do know a lot of people aren't really aware that they need to register their groups, in particular very, very small groups, and they're the ones that I think do need some support. So thank you for allowing me to raise. I'm just hopeful that we could find a way around this particular issue with regard to offering some support or information ourselves about this act to these groups of people.
Can I fit John in on that, please?
Yeah. I'm not sure necessarily as members you might want to put yourself in a position of giving advice on something that you're not an expert in, possibly, but I think if we can find the right channels of information to you to give out to those organisations, that might be a better route. So I just made a note of it, and I'll certainly look into it for you.
Okay, thank you. Lisa?
Yes. I went to a standards committee last month, which was discussing conduct and dealing with residents. I'm currently in a position with a resident that I've been dealing with for the past year, and now if I don't respond within 24 hours, I'm then getting quite aggressive text messages, and that's becoming more and more apparent in my day-to-day communication with residents. I just want some advice, or can we come up with a response, or how long we should or we will respond to you, because we don't want to put out of office responses on, because we want people to know we're not in our houses. But I just need some guidance when dealing with these pushy residents. And these aren't regarding issues. These are becoming quite casual text messages, so I don't feel I have to respond, but could we agree on, I'm currently not available. If it's urgent, maybe the landline here is where they can contact people, and maybe that would deflect the communication with them.
Matt?
Yes, I can just come in on that. Thank you, Chair. Some members may be aware, it's not something we've shared widely yet, but we've got a piece of work ongoing at the moment around customer service or customer experience. And it's really important to us. I think it touches upon some of the issues you've raised there. Because the authorities' current customer service arrangements are somewhat dated, I think. They date back to the times when most of our communication came through in the form of letters, and it's we will acknowledge receipt within 5 days and furnish you with a full written response within 20 working days. But actually, the world has moved on a lot since then, and it's actually, no matter what we do, it will move on even further, month by month by month, as new apps and mechanisms for contacting us become available. So one of the things we're looking to do, and it might be a useful one to bring back in terms of the issue you've raised to this committee, is as part of this customer experience work, look at those standards, and as part of that, give better advice to both officers and members about how to handle communications in an ever-connected digital age. Some appropriate responses where people are seeking information or responses back in an unreasonable time. But also, I think, in terms of that broader piece of dealing with, I guess, what many people have experienced as what can be more, I suppose, aggressive or sort of fairly hostile communications in the digital age, more so than any of us may have experienced, in telephone communications or in written communications. So, absolutely right. Recognise the issue, and I think it's something which increasingly more and more of us have experienced as we've moved in the digital age. So we will look to wrap that up into this piece of customer experience work, and actually, as we start to develop this, it might be something we can do in terms of getting a sort of small group of members to work alongside officers in terms of testing out some of the tools and approaches that are developed through that work, to think, well, how would this play out in a ward role and in some of your communications with the people you deal with day to day.
Thank you. A number of us were talking about these issues that some of us have come up with. In particular, it was a group of female elected members, and we've all started to encounter increasingly hostile environments in which we are encountering residents who are being more aggressive towards us. One of the suggestions we came up with as a group was whether it be possible with our IT setup that when we get an external message that comes in, it has an automatic response that goes out saying, we acknowledge receipt of your email, we will endeavour to get a response to you in X amount of time. Not obviously for internal emails, if we can differentiate that in the IT system, which I think is doable, but that would at least give us this idea in which we're not expected to respond to every single resident's query or external body within 24 hours, and we then get hassle if we don't actually respond in that way.
Yeah, if I can come back on that, and actually there's something that the digital office are looking at the moment, actually, in terms of trying to better connect up email traffic, and actually as far as possible, trying to minimise email traffic by greater use of forms, which would actually help depersonalise some of this, because instead of emailing you an issue and you then being responsible for it, making it easier for people to sort of fill out forms that immediately directs that through to the appropriate officer for a response. So it could be the individual gets that acknowledgement and it's actually automatically forwarded into the system, and it will vary by service. You know, some things are easier to automate than others. I think one of the first ones we're looking at from what Carl is fly tipping. Will be sort of automated end to end. And then I suppose the next part of that is understanding how you as members are able to have an oversight of the issues that have come in, that would have come to you, so you can still maintain that overview of the important issues at a ward level and still maintain that elected member role of ensuring that as a council we're doing the things that matter to your residents and which you would normally have been involved in correspondence about. But ideally, lessening your role in some of those streams of communication that could be automated. And of course, the advantage of that to individuals as well is it makes it far easier for them to raise some of those issues out of hours. And the other area we're getting into in that space is looking at deploying a chatbot on the website, which we've probably all experienced dealing with other businesses. So it sits in the corner, and that means that people can ask some of the more simple questions out of hours. But also, in terms of some of those more simple responses, ask those of a chatbot rather than necessarily having to phone up. Because if people are sat in a queue at our contact centre and they're asking something really easy, like what time does the hub open, or can I take this to a civic amenity site? Sat behind them in a queue could be a vulnerable person at point of crisis, or could be someone who's just about to be made homeless, who actually may not get through to us because of the volume of calls. So what we want to try and do is automate that which can be automated, so that the people in our organisation that have those skills of empathy and understanding can really focus on the things that add value. And I think that goes then in terms of for you as elected members. The more of this we can automate, the straightforward, then it leaves you to focus your time on those sort of advocacy and other roles at a ward level.
Tudor?
I did listen to Lisa's concerns lunchtime today. You know, I listened to them with some concern. And at the end of the day, obviously every elected member in this chamber takes their duties seriously. But it is not a full 24-hour-a-day role. And we are not, part of a paid service. And certainly people in the paid service wouldn't want to have something on social media or an email which is possibly unpleasant at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night. I had an email last night almost demanding a response about fairly innocuous matter about a meeting. And I must admit, I didn't respond. I didn't think it was appropriate at 10 o'clock at night. I'm not an emergency plumber or somebody in that role where you're paid to be on call. And it's certainly, say, anybody in the paid services, either chief executive or whoever, would not want to have to respond to something at that time of night. Personally, I haven't experienced that sort of issue as much as Councillor Dimmock here, but I think it is concerning. And at the end of the day, for example, elected members, people know where we live, people know. Well, obviously, you have to give out contact details because you want to interact with people in your ward. But I do find that concerning, and in terms of, if you like, the safety and well-being of members who have a right to a private life as well as a public life. And if we were employed by an authority, not just this one, then we would put our mobile phone onto answer phone or emails. We'd look at it at particular times. But I think particularly as well, if it's not to do with council business, then I feel that is almost bordering on the sort of threatening in a sense. And I think, if you look at currently, particularly women, I think are more vulnerable in that respect. And some people, to members of Parliament who are female, are extremely, abusive. And I hope it hasn't got to that with us at a council level. But I do think we need to seriously look at it. And we've certainly gone away from the letter and the pony and trap sort of mentality. Now we're obviously in a quick reaction. But, people in the contact centre are paid to be there for a shift and they go home. No one's going to ring them at home, are they? Whereas, unfortunately with us, people have those details. And I do feel a great deal of concern about that.
Councillor Taylor?
Yes, Chair. I think, the issue Councillor Dimmock describes is a significant matter, I think, and perhaps not one historically so associated with elected members. But I think that there's two things here. I don't want to conflate the two. The one is the automated response to kind of issues like fly tipping. That's great. I'm really pleased to hear that. It really seems positive that could be directed automatically to the responsible officer. Brilliant. I think the biggest saving this council could ever make in terms of its budgets is to get things right the first time without it trailing through dozens of people's inboxes, taking up time and money, because money is time and time is money. That's fantastic. On the other hand, I think that one of the things perhaps we can do, and maybe this is something we need a little more time to consider, what is the reasonable timescale for a member? And I'm not talking about an officer now, I'm not talking about somebody in paid employment with the authority, to respond. I would say that, generally, it's reasonable, I would say. I think most of us try and respond to members of the public as quickly as we can, certainly within a week, unless you are indisposed, unwell, unable to, on holiday. But I think it would be really helpful if there was some kind of line, a corporate line really, to assist us where we do have these difficult communications, where people are effectively and persistently asking for a response, which frankly on occasion is nothing to do with our role or council business. We were discussing earlier equally that we feel that members of the public have a very limited understanding of what elected members do in the kind of modern age, if you like. As you say, gone are the days where people used to write in and the member's secretary would write a letter back. And I think there is a job of work to really proactively take forward what we do, what people can expect from us, and what we can expect from them. Because there is, to a certain extent, it relates to some of the other items on the agenda in terms of what is our, public engagement in scrutiny and other aspects, because I think there's a bit of a two-way street here where we have to clarify what the role is. And, we are not a fixer, we are a facilitator. That's our role. We're advocates and facilitators, and I think it would be really helpful. If we could have some scheduled debate about a couple of those points. I know I'm going back to the last term where there was a couple of the white papers on local government reorganisation. Some people will remember this. And there was a call, for example, for members to give a definite timescale in which you would reply. And I think there was a reluctance to do that because we don't want to tie ourselves down. You know, there are, and also to do things like out of office. But as quite rightly Tudor points out, out of office response for a member can mean that you're not at home, and you don't want to do that because that, you know, is potentially making you more vulnerable. But I think we have to have maybe a bit of debate about it, and about what are the right things to do. What are the minimums that the public could expect, I suppose. And I suppose it's a question of what do we think as a council is reasonable. So we'll all endeavour to do our best, but there are points at which I think we also need a little bit of corporate support, because you're very much on your own as an elected member. Obviously, you've got perhaps your group or your party potentially, but ultimately you're on your own. And if you've got someone pursuing you, it can make it very difficult and very unpleasant. And I think perhaps, you know, it's unfortunate, but it probably is the right time to just, you know, sort of clarify what this council's position is on some of those matters. Thank you, Chair.
Do you want to come in, John?
I think it's not a scenario that's isolated to us, unfortunately, because the WLGA brought out a raft of guidance last month on online abuse, personal safety for councillors. So we'll circulate all that around to everybody. It'd be good to come up with an idea, a policy on response times and things like that, but I don't think it's up to the authority to tell members how to conduct their role as a member, and what would the sanctions be if they didn't abide by it. You know, the role in terms of what the authority can control is in legislation, and that's all. Literally, if you don't come to a meeting for 6 months, then you're disqualified. Anything above that then becomes council policy, and there would need to be some sanctions. Like I say, you could limit it, sort of extend it to attendance at meetings. What if someone's attendance isn't above X amount? The authority can't control it, but as members, if you want to put a policy forward, then council would have to agree that and have that in the constitution and agree it that way, kind of things. Just a different way of thinking about it. There's a lot of talk there on what the authorities should be doing, but it's difficult for us to tell you how to conduct your roles. But what we'll definitely do is see if there's some training sessions on personal safety for members, if we can get that in and get that organised, because it's obviously doing the rounds amongst all the authorities at the minute.
Did you want to come back in, Fran?
Yeah, just to say, it wasn't really a question of saying, you know, this is, I think there's two things there. It wasn't about sort of saying what we think around all member attendance. This was specifically around, I suppose it is aimed at that small percentage of unreasonable communication that you get. And I'm not sure, I think it's more of asking where we create a space to just have a bit of discussion on that. It could be that we have a members session, you know, a workshop or whatever, where we talk about it and we come up with a recommendation, and we talk about the automated message. So a message goes out. For example, if I write to Ken Skates today, I'll get an automated message saying we endeavour to get back to you within however many days. I'm not saying that's the right thing either, but I suppose it's something about advising people that a member role is a part-time role. It is not, if we're not full-time employees of this council, we're not even part-time employees of this council, and it is more and more the case that members have jobs, families, and all sorts of other things going on, and it, you know, arguably, if you're a member of staff working 20 hours or 37 hours a week, perhaps it's easier to dictate what the response time should be. But when you're an elected member doing it part-time in between all the other things, but I think what we wanted to do was to say, I guess, you know, generally, we try and communicate with you inside this kind of time frame. Just bear with us, because, you know, actually this is, you know, and some kind of understanding, so that we generate something which says, you know, that there is potentially a delay. And then if you get back in an hour, then so much the better. If you get back within a week, then fine, the person's not expecting you to reply to them by 48 modes of communication, within 24 hours. Because, as you say, as Tudor says, we are not an emergency service. And when people ring you on, Sunday and expect an immediate response, then sometimes that's, because you kind of almost have meant people sometimes expect you to be available for everything and anything. And there's a need for us to explain to the public, I think, that whilst, this is a public service role and we put in a fair amount of voluntary time too, there are limitations on what we could be expected to do.
Then if we can get the training session in on the personal safety, perhaps that's the best point to stimulate the conversation then. But in terms of your out of office to, not out of office, your response to external emails, you can do that already, just using the out of office. So I'll send you through some guidance on how you can set that up.
Right, thank you. Neil. Yes, David.
There is one other aspect to it as well. You can be away for holidays, or you could be ill, or all sorts of things can go wrong. The wife caught you coming in late and sorted you out, and you're not fit for combat for a week or two, something or other like that. But the point I'm trying to make is a very simple one. In my commercial life, where in many aspects where you're dealing with the public, it is very similar to here, only it's businesses. We worked with a buddy system. So my neighbour in a guy with, when we were talking about territories or areas of business, whatever you want to call it, we had more than a passing knowledge of what was going on in each other's territory. And that became known locally within the area. So it should be able, if you've got somebody who's sick or whatever, away for some reason, away from his post, that there should be a system, if you're trying to be accessed, then it would say, Councillor David Dovey is unavoidably unavailable for the next 3 months due to ill health, or something or other like that. And it should lay down who you should speak to. And it shouldn't be a role where you have to cover everything and take a business decision for me, but you should be able to hold the fort and be able to make sure the client or the individual outside is looked after properly and they're aware of what is going on. It isn't a difficult thing to do, especially with modern day technology. And indeed, some of us do it unofficially with one another anyway. But there should be able to be something that you could put in place that would do that, and that would take an awful lot of the pressure off on occasions. The other thing is that there really ought to be a way that of filtering some of the email stuff that comes through if you're away for a prolonged period. I mean, I was away for approaching a month, and I had and I couldn't work. I just couldn't work, and I had 600 emails to deal with when I came back. And I mean, there ought to be a way of filtering that stuff, but you've got to look at it because you don't know what you're missing if you don't. So we ought to look at those sort of areas. And I'm really sorry to hear about the ladies here. I think this is most regrettable. And I've got to say it's something my wife, she never suffered from that. She never suffered that. Mark you, they might have known that she wouldn't suffer from that. If you don't, I mean, she's a very direct lady. it is grossly unfair that any member of the public should behave towards our lady councillors in that way. I suspect they wouldn't do it with the men, and that's not being sexist.
Thank you, David. Right, I think let the open forum very well do it and raise their concerns. I'll get on to the agenda now, which is to receive the minutes for the last meeting, 12th of March.
Move,
All
Chair.
agree? Thank you. Number 5 is a demonstration of remote working security members' IT issues. Over to you, Kyle. Kyle.
Thank you very much. Sorry to bore you with this today. I'll try and be as quick as I can. Basically, I'm here today just to emphasise the email that we've put out recently. Would you be able to put? Yeah, please. You may or may not have seen this email come out about a week or two ago. Basically, we're going through some changes over the next couple of weeks. They are mandatory changes and they're happening to the whole organisation. We're moving to a product called Microsoft Office 365. Basically, what that means is we'll be moving our infrastructure into a different environment, so it's called the cloud. We've tried to structure it in as simply as we can, but there's a number of changes that will be taking place. The first change is our security. There's going to be another layer of security coming on. That's been advised by our security team to improve our cyber security. And that means when you log on remotely or you access your emails, there's another layer of security you have to go through. It takes approximately 15 minutes to set up. Once you've done that, it's not that much more you have to do each time you log on. It's probably an extra minute, if that. But everyone has to enrol for this, and I'm aware that a good few of you have enrolled already, but this has to be done by the 30th of April. Unfortunately, there is no leeway with that. When the 30th of April does come, everyone will be switched over, and if you don't, then unfortunately you won't be able to access your emails or the systems remotely. We are putting on drop-in sessions. If you are struggling to follow them, then there's sessions where you can go and see one of our team from SRS. So on the hub, when you go to the hub, there's an icon in the middle that says help, or at the top there is a banner there at the moment that says this applies to you. You can click on that, and there is a range of information there, and there's some video tutorials and some written instructions on how to go through this enrolment process, and there's various links to support that you can follow. The drop-in sessions, they're only going through this week now. They were happening last week and this week. Today it's in Mega, tomorrow County Hall, Wednesday Mega off the top of my head, Thursday County Hall, and then Friday Mardy Park. So they're the only ones that are running, and then it'll be changing over. I was going to give you a demonstration today, but I don't think it's the right setting. If you would like to have any more information, come see me after, or come to one of the drop-in sessions. I'll pause there because I think there's a few questions.
Thank you, Chairman. I was just going to say, if members go along to Democratic Services, they can get it sorted out in about 3.5 minutes.
That long, Paul?
Yeah, it's working fine at the moment, but John has indicated to me that there may be a question mark over mobile phone use.
Okay, around mobile phone use, there's 3 different methods you can choose to register with for this extra layer of security. One is using a mobile app, so as you may have done yourselves, download Twitter, Facebook, that type of thing. It's just another app. It's called Microsoft Authenticator, and you only use this app when you need to remotely work. So it only asks you to allow yourself to get through when you're using it. So it's entirely down to you whether you use that app, if you've got a personal mobile. The other 2 methods are you can have a text message sent to your mobile phone, and that simply gives you a code like any modern day security with your bank perhaps, they send you a code to verify that. It's exactly the same thing to get onto our systems. The third method of authenticating is via a phone call. So you can choose whichever phone that is, but essentially a robot will call you and say, you are trying to authenticate, please press hash to approve, and that's the way it works. Is that okay? Yeah.
Just a question, Carl. You mentioned at the outset that this was for remote working to work from home, and also for email access. At the moment, I go straight into my emails. Obviously, my tablet is security protected. I enter the password, and my emails come up automatically. Now, is that going to continue to happen, or will I need to use this additional security to get into emails?
That will also require the additional security. So on your device, you use that one that's corporately issued. This layer of security will take place on that device as well. It's any remote working solution. So we are an agile organisation. These are remote devices, so it applies to these devices as well. It's not just your personal devices that you may or may not use. It's everything. Okay.
Sorry, what I was actually referring to is the fact that I can access my emails on this at home without the security, with logging onto the security aspect. It comes up automatically. The security protection for the tablet, I log on to that, but I don't go onto the remote working or the enhanced security to get my emails. So is that that's going to change as well then, is it?
I believe so, yeah. From what we're obviously working quite closely with the SRS on this, who are testing a lot of things for us. As far as I'm aware, up until now, that layer of security will need to be used. It won't just automatically pick up your emails without using the VPN currently. It will have to go through the layers, from what I've been told, because our security should be more for what we're going to.
Yeah, I just thought that was important for people to be aware of, because if you haven't got your phone with you, you're not going to be able to log on and pick up your emails without this additional security. Yeah.
Joe.
Thank you. So at the moment, I get my emails come through on my phone as well as on the tablet. How will it work for that? I've been shown how it works on there, and that's fine. I understand all of that. But then how is it actually going to add on to my phone as well?
Okay, so with your phone, there will be some changes. So what I was going to move on to after this, so when you enroll for this level of security, there's some more changes that are coming through. So if I scroll down a second on the screen. So change 2 is the email migration. So our Skype for Business and our email will move on to this environment. It'll get migrated throughout this week. We've had a bit of discussion about this, but we're kind of thinking it's best that members are moved over midweek. So we can pick up any issues with other directorates at the start of the week, and you have a bit of time afterwards to do a number of changes. Change 3 then is once you actually move over, so that Wednesday when you change over, there's a couple of things you need to do in order to use this new email. One of which is download the new email app. So currently you may, depending on what device you have, you can sync your email to your device. In order to do that, when we move over, the current guidance we've got is that you'll have to download the Microsoft Outlook app. This may change as we need to get it firmed up at the end of this week. But currently the guidance we've been given is once you migrate over on your chosen date, which for members is looking like it's going to be the 16th of May, provisionally, you will need to change a number of things. For the majority of the organisation, all of these things will have to happen. For members, the most likely change that will only have to happen to you is to download this app. So we will send you guidance specific to that around the time. Is that okay?
Bring my phone to you and make you do it for me.
I'm sure.
David.
Could you tell me how young does my phone have to be? And secondly, have you got an app which will tell me where it is and whether it's charged at any time?
Graham Bell stamp on it.
You just go get one of those things you have for your glasses.
Pardon? No, the first part is fairly serious. I mean, my phone to me is just something that I want to use when it's an emergency, to phone out, or to maybe I've got a message from somewhere and to speak to a client there. But I don't use it like the vast majority of people do. I mean, it's my convenience. That is it. So I've got a phone that's quite old. So I think that our democratic services have done something to it. And I just don't turn it off now in case I'm missing something. But have I got to get myself a new phone?
Yeah.
The good news for you, Councillor Debbie, is you don't have to get a new phone. And
See this phone?
and
I've
there
had a new
is
spring put in it recently.
and there is an authentication method that you can use, and that is the phone call or the text message. The bad news for you is that you'll have to ensure that you carry your mobile phone on you if you intend to remotely work with your corporate device. But the good news is you don't have to fork out for a new phone.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Easton.
There's one query being raised by members who live remotely as opposed to working remotely. Councillor Smith doesn't get a mobile signal at home very well, and neither does Councillor Blakeborough. They won't have mobile access, so they won't be able to access stuff at home.
Okay, so in that instance, you must have maybe not a good one or strong one, but you must have an internet signal to be working from home currently. If you have a mobile device, a smartphone, then you should be able to connect that to the Wi-Fi, and you can use the recommended method, which is an authenticator app. So that works on the Wi-Fi as opposed to a mobile data signal. Another question that's just come forward. You can use a landline as well to access your remotely. So you can set your landline as your remote security solution. However, you've got to bear in mind that landline is in one place. So if you choose to remotely work somewhere else, then when the authentication method comes through, it's going to go to your landline and not the mobile on your person. So essentially, it'll only work if you're remotely working from home.
Chairman, just very briefly, I'm grateful to Democratic Services for setting me up. So we go through the three little plots, and I presume members are getting emails off me because it says you can't connect to Citrix, but we carry on working. And did you get a response last night, please, John? Saying to me, yes. That's all right, system's working, that's okay.
Just to finish off as well, obviously these changes are taking place, and when you migrate over, hopefully it's going to be as smooth as possible. We have got a pilot group going the week before, so we can pick up any issues. So hopefully it should be absolutely seamless to you. But time will tell. And then the last bit of the email that we sent out was just about the additional benefits. So there is a business case around this. There is some benefits that the whole organisation is seeing. And I believe my colleague Sian is going to be publishing that somewhere on the Hub very soon. So if you'd like to have a look through that, please do.
Any further questions? Any further questions before Kyle goes? No?
How long
I hope that's all clear to you. Thank you, Kyle.
You're welcome.
Right, we're on to the next item now, which is item 6. Item 6, democratic oversight. Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So a verbal item, but will be followed with a written report, probably at the next meeting, and it talks in part to a paper you received at the last meeting. But essentially, just as a sort of recap, the committee's got a remit to tongue-tied there for a moment. Got a remit to review the adequacy of the arrangements in place to discharge democratic services functions. If you recall, back in September of last year, the Council's report template was amended to include a section on evaluation. And in part, that was response to some feedback we'd received from Wales Audit Office, who suggested we need to do more work in terms of evaluating the effectiveness of our major service changes and transformation. Clearly, one of the things that means is that all of these reports that now go through to Cabinet and the Council, or an awful lot of them, recommended service changes, have a paragraph that says we will evaluate this in the following way, and we will produce an evaluation in 6, 12, 18 months. Potentially what that could do, if you think about the volume of business coming through the organisation, is tie up committees, Cabinet, Council, receiving back a myriad of evaluation reports, which would effectively almost create a second report for every report that's written. So what we're proposing to do, and very interested in views and thoughts on this before we sort of shape it up into a paper and a recommendation, is presently, since this change has come in, Democratic Services colleagues alongside business support that sit with the senior leadership team have started to keep a log of the decisions going through, and those decisions then when the evaluation is due to come through. Now, this change happened in September, and most of them at the earliest say it's going to be evaluated in 12 months. So this increase in reports will start it as potentially from September onwards. So what we propose is that those reports that are back on evaluation should be made available to the meeting that made the decision in the first instance, but that they don't go back automatically on full. They're effectively given for information. And that as members, you have access to a log of the decisions that have been made that require an evaluation, when that evaluation is coming through, and perhaps a sort of a couple of lines or a paragraph just giving you the headline of that evaluation. And what that would enable us to do, as Democratic Services Committee, you could maintain the overview of that log in terms of forming a view of the effectiveness of decision-making arrangements. The body that made the decision, be it Cabinet or Council, could opt to take a look on an exceptions basis, and then that would be available to all select committees to inform their work programme. So where it fits with that work programme and select committee chairs identify a particular need to look at an evaluation, that could be brought forward in more depth. So in a sense, that just was the basic premise we're working on. But before working that up into a firm proposal and bringing it back to you as a committee to sort of reach a decision on that, or make a recommendation through that should be our agreed position. I just wanted to sort of open that up for discussion as to whether that seems a sensible way forward.
Thank you, Matt. Any questions, Joe?
It's not particularly a question, it's generally a comment. It sounds very sensible. I mean, I don't think we actually want to get a report for every single report that we've already had go forwards, but I do think it's quite important that we are able to reflect on whether the decisions we've made have actually been effective. So I think your suggestion with a quick kind of headliner so that we can look at that, and then the scrutiny committees can evaluate whether they want to bring something forwards, or council can look at it as well. So yeah, it sounds a good idea.
Judith?
I think it makes eminent sense, and obviously in these days of transparency, etc., we need to be able to demonstrate that, and I think for us as a committee, we need to be in that position, but not on every small bit, but obviously to have an overview, I think it makes good common sense.
Thank you, Matt. Are you taking item 7 as well, Matt?
Yes. So similar, item 7 is also a sort of verbal item. But just to give a recap on this, there are two issues tied up in this. One of which is the future generations evaluations that accompany reports, and the other one is something that was raised at a previous meeting, not of this committee, a recommendation that summary reports be produced for reports, a one-sheet summary page. So it was to raise those and sort of have discussion on those issues. And I think certainly it's on the council action log as for discussion at this committee. And I guess a couple of that. Sort of firstly, in terms of the summary report, Chair, if I may sort of say a couple of things and then sort of open up, because my view may not necessarily be the view of the committee, and I'm an officer here to do your bidding.
We had this discussion as well.
When did that start?
I was yeah.
The notion, I think what was mentioned is the possibility of democratic services officers writing a summary of all reports. And I think the reality is that would place our democratic services colleagues in quite a difficult position, not just in terms of the workload they have at present, but actually in terms of they would not be the authors of those reports. And as we all know, when we've written, it's very hard to summarise and to distill and to make sense of someone else's work. So I think, as I understand it, the issue here is that as members, you are receiving a large amount of information and very many lengthy papers, which it's very hard to digest and comprehend and make sense on. So that seems to be the driver behind a desire for a summary to accompany each report. So what I sort of propose is sort of working up a couple of options for you. But I think one of them is, with the myriad of changes going on, the amount of business being generated by this council, and also it touches upon a conversation myself and Hayes were having last week that I'm sure will come up in the scrutiny self-evaluation, is that are we as officers giving you as members enough sort of information for you to get a sense of what's going on around the organisation? Can you, in a sense, sort of put your finger on what's happening in different places? Because what I'd be loath to do is sort of introduce a new process into a committee realm that adds more pages to document packs. Because I'm conscious, and this has come up before, that issues sometimes can be put forward for scrutiny, not because they need to be scrutinised, but often because as members you don't feel you're having adequate information on certain issues. And scrutiny is one of the few tools you have available to you to request information be put before you formally. I'm still seeing a few nods of heads, and I sort of just want to check. That's a question, Chair.
Councillor Taylor?
It may be that this, I made a suggestion at the budget meeting that what should accompany our reports is upfront the key issue. So if there's a key issue, it should be summarised up front. So, for example, we were discussing this today. Let's take the proposal to charge for breakfast clubs. When we received that report, because there are issues right up front in the key issues section, it should tell us that what those are, rather than maybe 6-8 pages into the report. Because one of the issues that we have here, and I think this is this will be something that hopefully will move with the social justice portfolio and strategy, is that these issues are not at the heart of our decision making, and in order to give them a little more prevalence, because I think sometimes, undoubtedly, when people are scanning through for information on what the key issues are, they need to be upfront and really clear. So, summarised up front doesn't mean to say that needs to be long. Doesn't mean to say that needs to be a replication of what's in the full future generations assessment or equality impact assessment, but it needs to identify that there are or are not issues. And I think that what that should mean for both officers and members is that should, you know, should lead to greater clarity on what the, you know, what is it that we're looking out for. Sometimes what's identified up front in reports, you know, you got to read the report 6 times to find out what the officer's referring to. And also, you know, if we're having reports for noting, then that's, you know, if a report is a decision, what's the decision and what are the key issues? And as part of the key issues, anything identified in future generations or equality impact assessments should be identified there, and they're currently not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what you raise is a very good point, because I was going to touch on this in more detail, because I guess we've got a number of issues here. One is the summary of reports per se. You know, are the length of all reports too long? And then the point which Councillor Taylor rightly makes, I think alludes to an issue. I recall you raising it in a meeting and getting a response from Councillor Jones regarding those future generations evaluations where we have the equality impact element and the fact, if I understand this correctly, that is sometimes lost within a myriad of information, and it's very hard or harder for you to see the direct impact of that. Because there was some discussion, for example, I think it was Councillor Howarth that raised it at one meeting, as for example, whether the future generations evaluation should come before the report. Now, I'm not sure whether the sequence in itself would help, but I think the point you make around a clarity of summary of those issues is one, and I think there's certainly a lot more we can do to improve the clarity of that paragraph that summarises the future generations evaluation, and it's something we've started to explore. Just allow me one moment, but also more broadly the quality of the evaluations itself. And I think we do have, when we've recognised an issue there, is some work ongoing in terms of officers who are now sort of brought together a panel. And what we're looking to do with that is a couple of things. One of which is, after the event, quality assurance, as in what would we have done differently, but also giving officers much earlier sight and encouraging report authors to complete those evaluations much earlier in the process, so that the sorts of issues they're raising, be it impacts on groups with protected characteristics, can be identified much earlier, and that mitigating actions can be built into the proposals rather than being an afterthought, which is the risk you run when these things are completed much later in the process.
What you detailed there is what we're supposed to do, which is to identify any potential impacts very early on. And what we discussed earlier is when we were discussing the social justice strategy was to have a much more robust quality. You know, I discussed this with Paul Matthews after the budget, because I was really quite taken with how poor some of the assessments were. But I suppose there are two things, aren't there? We need to strengthen that capacity within the council corporately. That's what the first thing. And secondly, I think this is related again to the next report, or to the report that Hazel is bringing, which is about the training for officers around, you know, their report writing. So there's training for officers and members. So members are asking more challenging, you know, appropriate questions, and they're able to do that more effectively, one would hope, because there's really clear impacts and you know, results in the reports that they're receiving, and part of that could be, you know, so the way we restructure our reports are obviously different depending on who writes them, you know, the report author, their style. I know that there's a broad template, you know, but the degree to which that's applied sort of rigorously, I guess, depends. And so as members, I guess, is part of training to be looking out for those things. You know, that summary should tell us in a paragraph what it is that we then got to read 30 or 40 pages if we want to find out more detail. These are the key issues. This is what you're looking for. These are the exceptions. You know, what, rather than wading through, because there is a lot of paper that we receive. Oh, it's not paper these days, it's virtual paper, but there's still a lot of stuff that you receive. And it's easy to hide a really important, not hide, I don't mean hide, purposely, I mean to, you know, not to bring that out into the fore. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you raise a very good point, and I think, as you've raised the issue that we have an inconsistency. Well, those report headings may be identical or should be identical on every report you receive. What follows and its ability to present concisely the issues you need to understand as members varies between authors. And there's a certain amount of that we can cover off with training and guidance. I think the other element is trying to eliminate that practice through a number of areas, one of which is the questions you ask yourselves as members, that insightful questioning to cut through that. But the other aspect is, quite genuinely, as sort of head of policy and governance, I have a responsibility around this. And if you feel you're getting reports from certain officers or you see a pattern in certain areas where those reports are not as clear as they should be, they may not always be things you want to raise and name individuals in a forum such as this. But actually, if you want to give me a call or drop me a note, because it could be there are patterns there and there are certain areas of the council we can target in terms of support if you feel there are particular areas that are not producing the quality of report you would like. And it might simply be that we can put a little bit of support and guidance into those teams to help raise the quality of those reports.
Thank you, Chair. I think what Francis says is largely right. I remember going to a presentation once, a business presentation, and it was by Bear Grylls. He's the youngest guy that's ever climbed Everest, and when he made it a successful climb, 48 hours before, his best pal died by the side of him. But that's a bit of a thing, but it gives you an idea of what sort of guy he is. And he said in his business life, and the thing that moved him in just about everything else he did, was what he wanted in front of him was bite-sized chunks. And he said, when I went to climb Everest, I didn't go, whoopee, look at that, let's get at it. He said, I planned my way up, and every part of that was building towards the climax, if you will. And he said, what you should be doing in presentations is leading your audience. So you start off in the foothills and you get it absolutely right. You agree where you're going. And those steps all the way through should be clear and concise, and there's an art in writing in a clear and concise way. I hold my hand up and say I can't do it. I've been trying for years. But you work your way through, and I think very often what we get is an awful lot of information. And, you go and bury yourself in the corner with a glass of whiskey and a light, and you start to try and wade through. There is a better way of doing reports than that. We want it in steps so that we can understand where we're going. We set off the ground rules, we understand where we're going, and you analyse it, and you're on board with it as you get to the end. And the whole object of it is to make it easy for us as a council to make a decision. I mean, that is the object, making it easy for us to make a decision, and the right one. And attempts to write War and Peace on occasion on the way through, with some people, is not the way to do it. So what Francis is saying is right on the button. It's in steps, it's brief, it's concise, and we start off agreeing exactly where we want to be, and we move through that step by step by step. And I'm sure we'll get better decisions and more timely decisions.
Thank you, David. There's no other questions. I shall go on to item 8, which is the forward work plan. You've got that in your pack?
Yes, Chair. The Scrutiny Forward Work Programme is tabled to for information because, as you will probably be aware, it used to be tabled to the Coordinating Board, which now no longer meets. I don't propose to talk members through it. There's only one thing that you might want to be aware of, which is that we had a first initial officer meeting this morning on City Deal, and the proposal is to establish a formal joint overview and scrutiny committee of City Deal, which would require a representative of this council to sit on that formal committee. So I'll be taking that through the scrutiny process, through Economy and Development Select Committee, and then there'll be a report to council. So just to watch out for that. Okay, I don't propose to talk through the work programme, Chair.
Right, thank you. Any questions on the work programme? No? Oh, yes, Councillor Tate.
Just one, sorry, Chair. Picking up further on into the into the next report, where it talks about the capacity in scrutiny. I mean, there's clearly a really significant workload, but I just wanted to note that looking at the forward work programme for scrutiny, and it would seem to me, you know, I don't know whether you would agree with this, but as decisions become more difficult, you know, pre-decision scrutiny is likely or could or should probably increase. So there's just a question for me, really, about capacity.
We'll come on to that in the next item, but just for you to note, the Scrutiny Forward Work Programme is usually around 21 pages. It's less because as we're coming towards the end of the scrutiny year, which finishes sort of July time, we take off all the old items. So obviously it's 6 pages now, but that doesn't show all the previous work. It's just ongoing forward. So yes, if you want to have copies of previous ones, but we can pick up capacity, I think, in the next item, Chair.
Yes. Any other questions? No? I shall go on to the next item then, which is security self-evaluation. Who's taking that?
Yeah, me. Yeah. Without wishing to do war and peace on scrutiny, which is what you've been provided with, I've produced a few short slides just in case you haven't had a chance to read the report or perhaps the executive summary. The executive summary brings out the main sort of findings in the report, but we can just go through them. But just to give, I know you're clear of your responsibilities as a committee to scrutiny, but for the purpose of this being a public meeting, I think we should just outline them. So I've alluded to them in the cover report, but basically what I'm bringing to you today is a self-evaluation of the scrutiny function, which was conducted in November 2017. So the reason for bringing this to you is Democratic Services Committees were established under the Local Government Wales measure of 2011 to ensure that you are responsible as this committee for prioritising support for non-executive members. So there's a quote in the cover report from Carl Sargent which says that your responsibility as a committee is ensure that non-executive members are fully supported in the critical role of scrutineers. So that's the reason that I'm bringing this to you today. I'm not really bringing it to you for you to scrutinise me in terms of my performance, because that is conducted by the Audit Committee, but I'm happy to take comments on that anyway. But basically the distinction is that the Audit Committee has responsibility to ensure that we have fit-for-purpose scrutiny arrangements in place, and it's also their responsibility to make sure that the scrutiny function is performing effectively. And I report to them annually, and also Matthew is my line manager, and so therefore at a strategic level the oversight of the scrutiny service plan is through the Council's Audit Committee. The actual responsibility for taking forward the actions from this self-evaluation that we'll talk about now sits with the Scrutiny Chairs Group. That is the scrutiny chairs, the scrutiny champion, and our new cabinet member for governance who's sat at the back, Councillor Jordan, has a standing invite to those meetings. So we will be taking forward any improvement actions through that group for them and myself to implement through the scrutiny service plan. So where we've got to with self-evaluation, of self-evaluation over about 5 or 6 years, and that's been undertaken in conjunction with the Wales Audit Office, but prior to that we conducted some self-evaluation internally, so it's something that we've done every sort of year and a half to 2 years since, well, 2008. So self-evaluation as a tool is highly regarded by regulators because it demonstrates ongoing commitment to improvement. The first self-evaluation that applied the characteristics of good scrutiny was back in 2014. It was very successful, involved working with Caerphilly as a partner authority, so we had some peer review where we shadowed each other's arrangements. This time round, we've worked with Caerphilly and Newport to undertake the same principles, and the characteristics of good scrutiny has become the sort of formal performance evaluation framework. So it's the kind of performance indicators really for scrutiny that Wales Audit Office applied. So the Scrutiny Service Plan is actually the Wales Audit Office Scrutiny Action Plan. So out of the previous self-evaluation, the Wales Audit Office asked every council in Wales to produce a formal Wales Audit Office action plan. I didn't see much point in producing that and also having the Scrutiny Service Plan, so they are the same document, and that fits well with auditors because they like it to be built into your improvement framework in your council. So the findings of the study, well, there were 3 separate groups: environment, practice, and we'll come on to those further through the slides. But first off, environment in which scrutiny operates was one of the sort of areas that's measured, and there's a set of questions around that, and I'm not going to bore you with those details. But basically, we undertook a self-evaluation, we had peer review from our partner authorities, and we also produced a questionnaire that went to all members and officers. It was just literally before the election, so it would have been the previous administration that completed this self-evaluation. The findings were written up by November, but again, it relates to the previous scrutiny chairs group who were the peer evaluation team. So it's their findings of where they thought we were up until that point. So clear and shared understanding of scrutiny's role and purpose. These are all pretty positive. You can see that they're all quite positive. They felt that scrutiny was generally respected in the council and also externally. They felt that we had good, effective relationships between scrutiny and cabinet. And they referenced particularly the scrutiny executive protocol, which we don't refer to many times these days, but that's a sign that everything's working. The reason we set up a task group, a cabinet and scrutiny task group that put together that scrutiny and executive protocol, was because back in 2008 we had quite a lot of difficulties with understanding the interface between cabinet and scrutiny, officers and scrutiny, and we didn't have the most effective relationship. Scrutiny wasn't particularly perceived to add any value to the council's sort of strategic direction, and therefore we had this task and finish group and came up with a clear set of expectations, mutual expectations between scrutiny and cabinet, officers and members, and that is now built into our constitution. We don't have to refer to it very often, as I say, because we don't experience many problems, but that's partly by getting everybody on board to produce that. Scrutiny was felt to be independent and apolitical here, which is a big positive, and governance arrangements largely understood by officers and cabinet and applied consistently. There was a sort of feeling that there was a clear and valued role for scrutiny in performance management and financial management, although it was acknowledged that we need to sort of perhaps improve some of the strength around the challenge. In terms of scrutiny practice, so this, when I said there are separate categories, scrutiny practice, whole host of questions around this area, but basically one of the questions was, is there independent dedicated officer support for scrutiny, as in, do you have a scrutiny officer? Yes, you do, it's me. In terms of members' capacity to constructively challenge, this was raised as an area that we need to sort of build on with training, and it was recognised by the former scrutiny chairs group that obviously with a new intake of membership, and we didn't know how many we would get, but we recognised there would be increased training needs, and essentially you have to start the whole process again. Scrutiny training is rarely a one-off sort of programme. It is a rolling programme where you have to repeat the training. You've got new faces coming in, and that can be evidenced across the select committees. There's quite a change across the committees that I've noticed. Again, we felt that practice varied across the select committees. They've all got their own cultures and operating style, and the sort of crucial aspect is the chairing to ensure effective questioning and driving agendas to clear outcomes. Matt's mentioned in his previous sort of discussion that some of the issues that we feel come to scrutiny are very important, but don't necessarily need scrutiny challenge. And I often have the debate with officers, what is scrutiny's role here? And they say to me, well, this is really important. It has to come to scrutiny. And I say, well, why? Well, it's really, really important. But when I ask them what the scrutiny role is, sometimes it's quite difficult to pinpoint that. So what Matt and I have talked about is it goes back to how informed members are and what you choose to prioritise for scrutiny. And I think certain members turn up to all scrutiny meetings and show a lot of dedication to that, and people want to know where information is, they want answers, they want to be able to have a look at reports perhaps to see if they'd like to scrutinise them. They might not want to scrutinise them, but they want to have oversight of them so that, you know, maybe they might not choose to scrutinise it, and that's something we need to sort of consider in the future. Is there somewhere where we can put all these reports so that we can sort of have a look at them and decide whether we want to bring them forward for scrutiny. Conduct's generally very good, but it was acknowledged that if you have one individual that performs poorly in an environment, it can really impact upon scrutiny's perceived value across the whole of the committee. One thing that was definitely highlighted by observers, by auditors and by myself is the low attendance of take-up at training sessions, and that's something that I need to work on. For example, we ran some training in December with you and it was well attended, and when I asked all the people that couldn't attend when they'd like to meet, they said Friday 4 o'clock. Now that would have been the last time that I would have picked for you to have a training session, but all of those members attended. So it just goes to show that sometimes we don't have all the answers, and we need to ask you and take on board different ideas, different timings, different days because of your working commitments. And the scrutiny chairs, as I mentioned, they recognise that new members would need more development perhaps this time around, and that as we progress through the next term, perhaps we'd be in a different place with our self-evaluation. And then the final category is impact. So, okay, we've got the environment positively right, we've got different sort of degrees of practice across the selects, we could improve on those, but what impact are we actually making by what we do? Well, one of the things that they did conclude was that we are increasingly holding external partners to account for decisions taken that affect residents in your county, and there were a couple of examples that were highlighted and observed, which was the scrutiny of Welsh Government and BT in terms of broadband provision. There was scrutiny of business rates, and also some scrutiny of the Health Board in terms of health services. So, I mean, obviously we don't have a statutory responsibility to obligate partners to attend, but we've built up good working relationships with them, and I think we've had some very constructive challenge on key aspects. Our attempts to engage the public in our work, we have invited some stakeholders to particular meetings, the Young Carers Strategy. We had a meeting on stroke services, and we invited relevant service users to those meetings. But the extent to which scrutiny can afford real democratic engagement on some of the major issues that we're scrutinising is questionable at the moment. So I would say we comply in terms of all the legislation, but can we honestly say that we are engaging the people out there in everything that we do? I'm not sure that we could actually say that. And the final one, in terms of ways in which we can more proactively engage the public and bring the public's perspective into our work. Maybe Matt and I have had some discussions around different sort of ways in which we could do this, and that would be perhaps brought to you for discussion at another time. but it will form part of the action plan. One of the findings was to strengthen the level of challenge of the executive and officers. When external people observe you, because we're quite a friendly, collegiate sort of authority, it can appear that relationships are perhaps not as distinct and marked as they ought to be. And that is just an external perception, but it's something that I think we need to bear in mind. Our meetings are all webcast, but how we're perceived by the public out there is quite important. The officers actually acknowledged a need for evidence-based constructive challenge by members. So essentially, some officers felt that we needed to provide members with more training, and some of the findings from members were that we need to provide officers with training. So I think one of the conclusions was that actually we need to provide training for both. For officers on report writing, to make sure, as Francis has said, that those reports capture the right issues and that scrutiny is undertaken at the right time. But again, we need to provide some sort of further training for members on how to sort of challenge constructively. One of the things I've done as an initial start to that is to put a question template on all scrutiny agendas at the front page with a couple of generic questions that anybody could ask about anything, just so that if you turned up at a meeting and you thought, I really just don't know what to ask, there are some sort of broad hints on what things could be asked on a policy review, what performance questions may be asked, what finance questions could be asked. One of the criticisms was that members rely heavily on information given to them rather than gathering independent evidence to support their own sort of solutions or proposals. And I've heard members sit in meetings and say, we just scrutinise what's put in front of us. Now, that's not necessarily the answer, but I think there's also an onus on officers to make sure that the information that we do give you is the right information and in the right amount, the right quantity, that, as we've sort of alluded to already, issues are brought up front. But we also need to bear in mind that you will have your own thoughts, you will gather your own evidence from people in your community, different views, and we need to bring that to the fore rather than just receiving reports from us. And we started some work, haven't we, Matt, on balanced options appraisal and including that into the report template so that we're not giving you necessarily a prescribed option or a sort of pathway, but we're giving you different options so that you can think of the implications of each. So that's sort of a start towards this independent evidence sort of aspect. So the key improvement areas for the Scrutiny Chairs Group to take forward with myself, they fall mainly in the categories of scrutiny member training and officer training, but also improving some of our weaker practices. I think the environment, the first slide I showed you, was pretty positive. I don't think we've got so much work to do on there. But again, improving practice. We've got new members, quite a big intake across the selects. And as a result, I've developed a scrutiny member development programme which provides a sort of constructive challenge sort of session right through to some specifics on future generations and finance training. So that programme will be a rolling programme for the next sort of 4 years or so. We've also sort of committed that we will do some training with officers on scrutiny's role, on report writing, but also on the decision-making process in general and governance processes, because I'm not sure that everybody is perhaps as knowledgeable on perhaps governance as Matthew and myself and my colleagues are. So in order to make sure that those processes are right, we will be taking that forward as a key action. Final sort of couple of slides really on improving practice. We recognise that there's a clear sort of need to engage the right people on the right topics if we're going to deliver outcomes. So you'll notice that some of the scrutiny committees have really honed down their agendas and they're just choosing maybe 4 or 5 things to focus on this year. Some are just choosing to do sort of short scrutinies on lots of different things, but particularly some committees such as Economy and Development have focused in on just 4 or 5 issues, and we've started to sort of try and engage members in more value-added scrutiny. So in the past we had lots of task groups that We're mainly scrutiny-led. I don't have a great resource to be able to sort of run lots of task groups, but neither am I able to force officers to take on board all of the recommendations of scrutiny. So a couple of the things that we've trialled so far are workshops. We've done a few on procurement. We're having a few in the next few weeks on future economies, and those workshops seem to be much more engaging for members, a couple of hours, but unlike a seminar where you're just talked at, it's much more engaging and requiring you to actually perform a role at that workshop with clear actions for officers to take on board afterwards. So for instance, the procurement workshop, Scott will take forward those actions afterwards. It's not relying on us as scrutiny to sort of keep enacting all of the recommendations that you make. So again, as we just alluded to, trying to work with the public on decision making. I think there's a much bigger democracy agenda here than what we've talked about in terms of just the scrutiny process. So finally, just to give you a bit of a flavour of self-evaluation here, WAO 2006, scrutiny's ineffective, lacks impact. We were high risk to the council. I just joined at that point, and it wasn't pointed out to me at interview. I'm not sure if I would have liked to have heard that before I applied for the job. But yes, to be put in post for a function where you are effectively a big risk to the council's performance is not the best. We've made some gradual steps to improve. 2009, more robust challenge starting to have a positive impact. By 2010, we were becoming more effective, needed further development. Corporate assessment 2015, recognised scrutiny's improving, come a long way from a low earlier base. And they actually recognised through the corporate assessment that there's a lot of dedicated advice and training and a scrutiny member development programme tailored for you that's provided for you, and that was actually referenced in the report. So they felt that underpinned the scrutiny function. And they also they acknowledged that it was a really good culture here. They recognised we had the protocol for executive and scrutiny, and that because of that protocol we had mutual respect existing between councillors, officers, cabinet, and we had much more productive working relationships than we did in 2006. So I think that's a good flavour of where we've come from. Just for you to be aware, we've got some visits coming up from Powys County Council. They'd like to observe the next cycle of scrutiny committees because they're sort of in a process of self-evaluation at the moment. So the scrutiny chairs will be meeting with those members, cabinet members and scrutiny members after the select meetings that they observe, and we'll be having a sort of discussion on how things are here compared to in Powys. And then just finally, a few points I wanted to make, Chair, which is where does this go now? The Scrutiny Chairs Group will take forward an action plan that I will devise off the back of this. All sort of services have to produce a service plan. So, for instance, the service plan for scrutiny is the Wales Audit Office Action Plan, and that will be taken to the Audit Committee, but the scrutiny chairs feed into that plan, and it's often sort of discussed with WAO as the key regulator for governance. So I'm responsible, obviously, for scrutiny member development through this sort of arena, but your responsibilities, I guess, and this is why I've brought it to you, is for all members, but particularly in terms of my report to make sure that scrutiny is adequately resourced. So I'm sure you review all of these things anyway through your sort of oversight of, say, John's service plan. And, I'm sure that you'll be looking to make sure that you take forward some of the actions that relate more towards member training overall. But I will be producing a scrutiny action plan, which I'm happy to bring back here, Chair, or to simply take forward through the Scrutiny Chairs Group. And in conjunction with the Cabinet member, we've now got a responsibility to report to him also. So it's showing a bit of impetus, really, for the continuing journey. I say journey because there's never an end point, really. It's always working towards better sort of practice. Happy to take questions, Chair.
Thank you, Hazel. You was quite clear on your presentation, as always. Any questions?
Thank you. Yeah, great presentation. Thank you very much, Hazel. The area I think I focused in on in terms of the document that you produced was the very final section on it in relation to this committee, and that was public engagement in scrutiny and democracy. And I think it's something we've discussed at this committee as to how to try and get the public more involved in our scrutiny committees. And I think it is an area that we really do need to work on, because we don't get many members of the public coming in to ask their questions. It is a fairly infrequent aspect, and I think it's one that we really need to focus in on, and we need to try and think big picture. We've talked about, should we go out into the communities? Should we have meetings outside? Yes, we'll lose the live streaming, but then we might actually, by taking committees into the communities, they might actually engage a little bit more, or at least there's a chance, and we don't know until we try. And so I would be really enthusiastic to try and find more ways of actually getting our scrutiny actually into the people who really need to scrutinise it, and they are our residents, and they are the people who ought to really be looking at the decisions that this council makes.
Yeah, in the past, we did sort of take scrutinies out into the communities, and we found that we didn't have a great attendance, and obviously that was pre-live streaming, but my concern overall on that aspect is that I don't think scrutiny committee meetings are actually the right forum to engage the public at all. We do have public open forums on all our agendas, which some members of the public who are aware of it will attend, and they will come for specific matters. But when we say to them, would you like to stay for the rest of the meeting? They can't wait to rush to the door. They don't want to stay. Whereas we've had some really successful sort of engagement with, say, young carers on the young carers strategy, which was eventually brought forward for scrutiny. And we actually had young carers at the meeting, but prior to that, we'd actually had a whole day with young carers in developing the strategy with them. So the CYP Select Committee worked with the young carers to develop their own strategy. So by the time it came to the scrutiny committee, they did attend and they said a few words, but it was difficult because the meetings were held in school time and for them to get the time off. But I think much more important was the actual engagement that took place before it came to the committee, because by the time it came to the committee, they'd had a lot of engagement with young people. And we did one which I'm not sure if any of you guys here were involved in, perhaps Val. We engaged with the Gypsy and Traveller community when we were developing the strategy, and we had a meeting with them long before the select committee, sort of a couple of weeks before, but we did so in an environment which was comfortable for them. And it was the whole committee meeting with representatives, and we had a really good debate, so that by the time that strategy came to scrutiny, members were very informed about different people's needs and wants, and they came and observed the meeting as well. But I think we have to recognise that not everybody feels comfortable coming into a very formal environment, and this sort of setup works very well for holding to account, for challenging Welsh Government, so that cross-examination works really well. But when you really want to go out and talk to people, I think we need to get out more, and we need to talk to people, perhaps have democracy days, debate days where we go out into communities and actually debate on specific topics, specific reports that are coming through perhaps from the council. We've agreed to take a strategic direction towards City Deal. What does that mean for people out there? What would they like to sort of, take on board? And I think we need to be more proactive in doing that rather than relying on people to come to our meetings.
Councillor Taylor.
I was going to say something very similar, really, in that I think if we really, well, there's two things about it. And again, we kind of had part of the debate. If we want to go out and talk to people, we have to do it on their terms, in their place. So, for example, the young carers is a really good example. Or, for example, I've sat on not that I've actually sat on the corporate parenting panel, but I ended up, I don't know how really, going to a number of the corporate parenting meetings and talking to some of our the apprentices and so on. And actually, if we were going to engage with, and our foster carers, if we were going to engage with them, if we had something coming forward, I know Paul Matthews sent us out a a report that's come through around our corporate parenting function. If we were going to scrutinise that, we would have to make some very specific arrangements to talk to some of the children that we are corporately parenting. And similarly, I think that is also, which is related to my point around capacity, that's resource intensive. So I think part of the issue with this committee is it's had aspirations or, talks about doing things, but certainly in the last, term, at the end of the last term, there was a lot of, moving this committee responsibilities here, there and everywhere. And so I'm sure that we could do that, and we could do it well if we had the will and the resource to do it, because inviting people in works really well with other public bodies. Clearly, they would be foolish not to want to come and engage and talk to us. Other public bodies, third sector organisations, but where we are talking to people that we are actually meant to be providing services on behalf of, I think we have to be a bit more creative. But my question, so even if we say, yeah, that's what we're going to do, I think we'll have to prioritise what it is that we want to go out and engage people around, and how we want to do that, because we can't do it with everything, because we simply don't have enough resource. However, there is also a point about it depends who we think that whose job we think that is. So, for example, if we've got a corporate desire to do that, then we need to make it our service area's job to help us with that. It isn't, just the role of the scrutiny manager or just the role of, someone in democratic services to do that organising. And I think that's that for me would be one of the the key things I think we have to pick up. And again, it's about that kind of cultural shift, isn't it? So the question then is, how should democratic services be supporting that cultural shift to do things quite differently? That's the first thing. And I guess it's a question back to you as well, Hazel. I've got a couple of other points around, the capacity to do that, because whilst we need the service areas to take responsibility, scrutiny will, still have responsibility of kind of overseeing that and tying it into the scrutiny committee. So that's just one question. And then just a couple of things really in terms of the responsibilities that sort of fall to democratic services a little, because as you say, there's quite a clear route for most of this. But this area of the need to improve the evidence base, so that the constructive challenge is coming not just from what we've got in that report in front of us. I do think again that's something related potentially, do you, to the issue of how we receive the reports and the writing of them. And I wonder how this committee might be engaged in, we've mentioned this before, in that debate when we support officers, or the officers that are the main report authors, or we have officers coming through that haven't authored reports for these purposes before, and how we support them. And I wonder if there's something we could do in our work programme to be part of that. That's the one thing. And so there's two questions there. And the last one is the issue of people being engaged in scrutiny would seem to be also quite directly related to whether they perceive that scrutiny has an impact, i.e. changes the route or the feel or the kind of decision that gets made in the end. And I know that's improved in your journey, but I think there are still some question marks for members of the public about whether their engagement actually changes the outcome. And I wondered what your reflection on that would be and how we can improve that.
Yeah, the last question is probably the easiest to answer. I think we've got some good examples of how we've managed to actually improve the outcome. And I'll go back to the example on the Gypsy and Traveller strategy, because that actually came to a scrutiny meeting as a call-in several years previously. And it was a consultant's report that just put forward a proposal that nobody liked, not even the cabinet member. It was called in by scrutiny, and the cabinet member said, well, I didn't really think it was a good idea either. We had different representatives at that meeting from all walks of the community. Everybody had strong views one way or another, and the overriding lesson was that the process that we'd followed, as in we'd gone and got consultants to prepare a report, we hadn't really engaged with anybody through the process. The conclusion by scrutiny was, you mustn't do this again. Next time you do this, you need to take a completely different route. And the next time that this report came back to us, what happened was that instead of the consultants preparing the report, our officers worked on that report. They engaged with the community right through the process, got them on board, and then we met as a select committee with those community representatives before the issue came through to scrutiny, and we had a report that everybody was happy with. So it can be done, but it's the way in which you do things. And I think we have got some examples where we've championed on behalf of communities, such as the broadband. We've had Welsh Government in here to sort of say, well, how well are you monitoring BT's performance in terms of the rollout of Superfast Cymru programme? And we've had BT in to say, well, how are you doing with this? You know, and we've had a really good, strong challenge session where we had members of the public here directly asking questions of Welsh Government and of BT, and our cabinet members taken on some responsibility in driving those issues towards a conclusion, and they're due to come back very shortly. So I would hope to think that the people that engaged with scrutiny through that process felt that actually there was a point and a purpose to them giving up their time away from their businesses and their lives to come to our meeting and to be able to engage directly in that process. So I think there are certain instances when, as I say, this chamber works well in terms of cross-examination and challenge, but there are other examples where, for example, Children and Young People's Select Committee and Strong Community Select Committee would like to go and talk to some Syrian children that came here and see how they're doing in school, how performance levels are, what sort of extra support needs they might have. That's not something that we can do very effectively in a scrutiny committee. It's not the right arena, and we've got to think, as you said, more creatively about perhaps going to the school and just having a chat with them, you know, and then members can bring back to the committee their findings. But I think from my point of view, I'd like to see members more proactive, but I think the interest is there. I've never worked for a council that's had more interested members than this one, and I've worked for quite a few councils, but the interested people that want to take part in scrutiny are the ones that attend the meetings. I do appreciate with the political balance the way it is, some members are very stretched. They're on several scrutiny committees, and it's really difficult when there's meetings all the time to attend everything. So I think the committees need to be much more careful in how they prioritise issues, and I would say less is better, fewer items, but do them more justice and engage more proactively in them. I think your earlier questions were around capacity. My concern is not just capacity for myself, it's capacity for members. I know what your roles are like outside of scrutiny. I don't think that all you do is scrutiny. I know it's a really difficult job, and scrutiny is just one part of it. And we try to make things easier for you, but I think sometimes we could do better at that. So my thoughts are around capacity of members. If we keep setting up more and more task and finish groups and member working groups where we've got periodic attendance by different people and they're not being driven towards clear outcomes, I'm not sure that it's an effective use of your time or officers' time. So we've started trialling these workshops because we felt that from one workshop with you for 3 hours, we get a much clearer direction of where you want to head policy-wise, and we can take forward actions outside of that and come back to another workshop rather than ongoing task groups where we've got sort of dates set up for the whole rest of the year. And I can't remember what the middle question was.
It was just about how we get members and how the reports relate to
Yeah.
to go out and get that.
Yeah.
But it's also connected to the information contained in reports and
Yeah,
how
and
effective that and succinct it is, and to what extent we can rely on members to go and find independent resources.
yeah, and you can request of me certain parties that you'd like me to invite to scrutiny. So I think it's not always about you going out and having to do work, but it's thinking about every time you scrutinise something, rather than just having an MCC officer in front of you, what independent perspective do you need? Would you, for example, like to invite the Children's Commissioner in? Would you like to invite somebody from Welsh Government or a policy expert in a different arena? Or which stakeholders would you like to involve? Because I've taken a report to all the selects on co-option, and the sort of overriding response was that members didn't really want to sort of co-opt people formally onto the select committees, but to sort of move towards each time there's a topic, who shall we call in? So an invited representative. And sometimes that works a lot better because co-optees don't want to necessarily commit themselves to sitting on a select committee for maybe 10 meetings a year when maybe only 3 of those subjects are of real sort of significance to them. But I think if we're going to not have co-optees on our select committees, we've got more of a challenge in terms of how we bring in that independent perspective. So I think every time we scrutinise something, when I go through the forward work programme at the end of each meeting with the members and I say, right, we're looking at this topic at the next meeting, I'm trying to get from members a sense of who they'd like to hear from so that we've got a bit of an independent dimension. Okay.
Thank you, Hazel. Judah?
I know it's very difficult, but I think in terms of democracy, you know, where we are in Esk, we're quite far removed from quite a few of the communities. We're in a relatively low populated area here of MCC, and for people living in Abergavenny, they would sort of see that, and particularly on a winter's evening. Anything I think we can do to sort of engage in that way is important. I'm on the Looked After Children panel, and coming up now, there's going to be a coffee morning with foster parents. There's going to be something like a 10-pin bowling event with those young people. I'm looking forward to that because I want to hear what those people have got to say, and not that in any way that an officer is sort of giving me the wrong information, but at the end, you want to speak to the end user in a sense, don't you? Because, you know, they are the ones who are affected by decisions that say that Looked After panel makes. And I can appreciate perhaps that is a slightly easier one to tackle. But I think specific issues, you say, like broadband, people will turn up. And I've been to meetings because obviously it affected me and before I was a councillor. But it is quite difficult. And as you say, it takes time from full-time officers, but also from elected members. But I do think it's an important aspect that we need to keep coming back to, and to try and go across to see what end users want. And it must be, this context is incredibly formal. If you're familiar with this, and lots of us are from our different jobs and roles, etc., it doesn't worry us. But official context, I can remember a parent waiting to go into a parents' evening. The head teacher was her son's or daughter's teacher, and she was very uptight. I've been a teacher, my wife was a teacher. School was second nature to me, but to lots of people, it's frightening. Somewhere like this, to some people, would be very difficult. It's a very bureaucratic, officious sort of the very setup of the chamber. So I think we've got to think about it.
Thank you.
I would say some of the most meaningful scrutiny that we've undertaken to date since I've worked here has been when we've engaged with key stakeholders and service users. Those are the memorable ones, the young carer strategy. Those are the ones that stick in your mind, not the routine reports that we get bogged down with. And I think a lot of the reports that we might receive are not necessarily exception reports. We get performance reports on everything because we're sort of we're persuaded to think that everything has to make it onto a scrutiny agenda. I think we could think about democracy days in different towns where we could go out and talk to people. But I think, again, on every single thing that we scrutinise, we need to think, who do we need to hear from, who do we need to engage with, and how best are we going to be able to do that? Because sometimes you can't second guess. I didn't think that young children would want to come and sit in the chamber and ask questions of members, which is why I set up a separate forum in the chairman's office with food and drink for them. And they said, no, we want to come in here. We're happy to have that, but we want to come in and use the microphone. So it just goes to show you can't second guess. But yeah, I think we need to be more creative around how we do scrutiny. Otherwise, I'm going to lose people's interest.
Matt, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. There's one piece to remind you of, and I'm feeling terribly guilty, or possibly, and you've all been terribly kind for not reminding me that some time ago, a few of you volunteered for a working group, which we put on hold pending the publication of the corporate plan. I think it was Councillors Woodhouse, Councillor Watkins and the Chair. And now it's possible you're all being very kind in not holding me to account for not having done that, or it was so long ago you've forgotten you volunteered. It could perhaps be the latter. But I think probably sort of today's discussions coupled with some of the very insightful thinking that I know that Hazel's been carrying out outside the meeting, some of which she's been kind enough to share with me, could give us the basis of some quite interesting proposals around how we could engage very differently with communities, not just around scrutiny, but around democracy more generally, and get that shift from a fairly sort of empty gallery doing the 15-minute public open forum to people having conversations with us, with you in their communities, and actually then chomping at the bit to come in when there's the opportunity to speak to decision makers. So it is there, very conscious. I feel I've let you down a little bit on the timeliness of that piece, but it hasn't gone away. And rest assured, we'll bring back something. Perhaps we'll work together on that, Hazel, and get that working group together. And if, given that the original offers to get involved were some time ago, if there are others that would look to sort of join a group outside of the committee to take that forward, the offer still stands.
Thank you, Matt. Councillor Easton.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yes, I support Hazel's analysis of scrutiny. I won't go back as far as the car parking one, but I do remember the Gypsy and Travellers, and I think at that time when you joined, I hadn't been, it was a little long after that. I think you had short hair, I had long hair, not quite sure. But I found some of them are more focused on specifics. For example, we scrutinised the Health Council for what they're worth. We also had presentations from the Stroke Association within our committees. But the one which stands out to me quite strongly, other than with others obviously, was the one we dealt with when the fishing rights in Abergavenny on the River Usk. I thought that was, we invited all the participants in that dispute to come and talk to us. I think they aired all their ire on us. I don't know what the final outcome was. Perhaps Councillor Jordan will know coming from Abergavenny, but I found that a very productive one where the public were invited to come. They were given free rein, and it was a good scrutiny. I don't say what the outcome was, but it was a good scrutiny process.
Thank you. I think we'll go on to item 10 now, which is engagement of the Democratic Service Committee ADM Management Agreement.
Chair, on this item, I'm afraid this was something that Kelly was due to speak to verbally. Unfortunately, as I mentioned briefly earlier, Kelly's unable to be here today for sort of unexpected reasons. Her daughter was unwell overnight. And so, Chair, with your permission, we have to bring that back at a future meeting. I'd look to see if someone else was available to take it, but at short notice, I'm afraid no one else was able to come in on that one.
So we'll defer that item to for the next meeting. Are you all happy with that? Right. Number 11 is Coronation Row. Who's taking that one?
Chair, we're fine. Chair, pick that one up initially. In terms of some of those items, Hazel's previously brought forward the work programme, which was sort of raised up early in the agenda. The only other issues that spring to mind, unless Hazel or John or Nicola have any, would be, Hazel, I know it was an issue you mentioned recently, and we've had a couple of instances of late where there are items which it's been mentioned could be looked at by, I suppose, an unusual combination of committees. So, for example, Hazel, you mentioned the notion of perhaps automation being looked at jointly by, I think it was Democratic Services Committee and Economy and Development. So it was just an opportunity to surface some of those issues and gain thoughts on those.
Just as a sort of context, really, the coordinating board, when it was in place, was a business management meeting that allowed referral of an item from one committee to another committee. So if Economy and Development Select Committee thought that perhaps another committee could take on board an aspect, and one suggestion is that the Audit Committee looks at how councils are financed and looks at the formula and has an explanation on why we don't do too well with that. Rather than perhaps Economy and Development leading on those issues, I think they were perhaps looking on the audit one to request a referral to Audit Committee, and similarly with this discussion that was raised at Economy and Development about automation, I think they thought that this was one that we could usefully perhaps refer to this committee. They've chosen to focus on 4 things this year, which are all very much within their remit, but of course they do identify other things that are of interest to them but don't necessarily fall within their remit. So this item on the agenda is to just perhaps fulfil that purpose that the coordinating board had, to allow a referral between one to another, and if members are minded to accept that referral, automation would come here as a piece of work for this committee to do. But I'm not sure how busy your work programmes are and whether, you know, there's an appetite to take that on.
Yeah, if I just sort of feed in that, I suppose it's an interesting one as to whether the topic of automation, such as it applies to, for example, the aspect of internal services, would be appropriate for this committee. So we'd be looking, you know, earlier on I mentioned, for example, chatbots. You know, that's one area of automation. Now, I don't want to sort of go off on a massive sort of talk around artificial intelligence at this time of the afternoon, but you know, the reality is any artificial intelligence is as good as what you program it in the first place. A chess computer can only play chess because it's been programmed with the matches of grandmasters of the past. So I think, you know, what we're looking at in terms of automation internally, some of the interesting aspects of that are how it interfaces with the public, as opposed to perhaps what it means for some of our internal processes. There could be some aspects in future coming forward, for example, automated minute taking at committees. Now at the moment, that is a long way off. We're not aware of anyone else in the UK using that technology for those purposes. I think at the point at which these sorts of solutions become viable options that start to impact on the democratic functioning of this body, then perhaps there are issues that the committee needs to look at. I think probably at the moment the sort of aspects of automation and technology we're looking at are probably closer to the remit of strong communities. You know, for example, what a chatbot means, how it'll make it easier or harder for people to engage, what it means for vulnerable people who may not have access to digital solutions, for example.
For that, put it on for the next meeting, so we can give some thought about it.
Could invite the Chair of Economy and Development Select to come and put the case forward. Unfortunately, I didn't have a great deal of information on that one because I was on holiday.
Chair, can I just say one thing? Just if I may, I think where that is potentially a matter, I suppose, for this committee is if it is around that, you know, our role is, you know, around part of our role is about promoting engagement with the public around, you know, democratising, you know, all aspects of the council's work, I suppose, and about access, I guess. So if that's where it's come from, then I guess I can kind of understand that, and I'd be interested about you know, how we can do that in terms of, you know, it's a bit convoluted, really, isn't it? When we've got area committees as well that kind of do some of this, but actually what we really want are governance mechanisms which are all intertwined and which enable, and that's the key word, isn't it? Enable people to get involved in participating in what their council looks like at whatever level. You know, if we were to use, you know, Arnstein's ladder of participation, you're right up to from the very bottom level of just, you know, kind of being fed bread and circuses right up to, you know, kind of involvement. And I guess perhaps it would be helpful, rather than to understand what our role is in pushing, you know, on that participation ladder and how that would relate. I think that is what would potentially be relevant to democratic services. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. As I say, I'm not quite clear of which avenue they were wanting to go down, but I do know that they have got quite a full work programme at the moment, and they felt it was something they could work with you jointly on, and there's nothing to preclude that happening, but I think it would sit neater with one committee in terms of responsibility to actually bring it forward to a conclusion and an outcome. But I think it would be worth inviting the members that raised it perhaps to come and have a discussion with you on what they actually sort of meant and which direction they think it could go in. They could do that too. Yes.
So can we invite them in, Hazel, to our next meeting?
Yes. All I was going to say, Chair, was simply in terms of some of the sort of the work that's going on around automation. I wonder if the other thing that might be useful, given it's quite a difficult topic to get your head around, or at least it's a very difficult topic for me to get my head around, is that actually alongside that we bring something forward in terms of the scope of the work that the authority is looking at the moment back to the next meeting, and then you can look at that, have a chance to consider it ahead of the meeting, and then you're able to give an informed view when the discussion happens regarding whether you do feel it touches upon those democratic aspects and therefore realistically fits with the remit of this committee.
Thank you, Matt. Right, so we'll fetch them invite them to the next meeting, and we'll go from there. Right. I'm going on to the next item now, which is 12, which is Council and Cabinet Work Plan. Who's taking it? It's just noted, right?
I think that's another one that was a function of the coordinating board, so
Yeah,
it was agreed that it would come to this committee just to ensure that there's oversight and avoid any duplication, really.
Right, and then 13 is to note the date of the next meeting, which is the 4th of June at 2 o'clock in the chamber. Can I thank you all? Was you going to? Oh, no, sorry. Can I thank you all very much for your attendance, and a safe journey home.